I had this crazy idea. Why don't I take a tube integrated amp like the Doge 10 and add an extra Class D module so I can have two amps in one? Now, assuming your speaker can buy amp, the idea is to combine two separate amps into one chassis and use this amp to buy amp. So the treble and mid-range, I can use tubes, and the bass, I can use Class D. After all, Class D is so small, inexpensive, and light, I'm sure I can somehow stuff a Class D module into the body of a Doge 10 amp. Think about it. All these SMSL Class D amps are like the size of a manga book. So, when I approached Doge with this genius idea of mine, they're like, what? But they were game. And they told me to look for a Class D module while they research on how to create this one-of-a-kind amp. Now, I know some of you are like, wait, Thomas, isn't that the same idea as the $60,000 Macintosh MC901? Well, kind of. But they use Class AB instead of Class D, and my amp will cost a fraction of theirs. Now, the problem was I am not a businessman, but an audiophile. So instead of looking for an inexpensive Class D module that makes financial sense, I went to look for one of the best top-of-the-line Class D module instead. I was looking at Ice, Encore, and Purify, and settled on Purify for my prototype. I wanted the best sound, period. And I heard that the Class D Purify amp is one of the hottest amp on the market right now. After deciding on the Purify and adding up the cost, I realized it is not cheap, and the final product would need to be like $6,000 to make sense. Sure, it is 1/10 of the price of the Macintosh 901, but I am not Macintosh. Macintosh can take a shoebox and put the logo on it and charge $500 for it. So I had to put this project on hold due to cost and work on another project, which is a KT150 tube amp that can run in Class A. Now that story I'll tell another day. Anyways, given I have this Purify DIY amp here, well, more like a self-assembled DIY amp, let me talk about it. Can this amp that costs $1,500 beat $4,000 Class D amp I've owned in the past? The answer is yes and no. There are some things it does better. There's one crucial thing it does not, and I will elaborate on it when I talk about what you should be aware of if you plan to buy this amp. I'll tell you now, this is better than the $500 XTZ Edge Class D amp I have, well, which is expected given it is 3 times the price. This Purify Class D amp outputs 425 watts into 4 ohms and 280 watts into 8 ohms. If you're interested in getting one yourself, you need to buy 4 components. You will need one ET400 Class D Purify module. What a weird name. And then you need the power supply, SMPS 1200A400, another weird name. And then the input buffer board, FE02A. Now, if you buy it from Purify website, they have a kit, and you can get the power supply from Encore, and you can get a casing from Ghent Audio. Now, Ghent Audio has a casing made specifically for this kit, fits perfectly. Now, for those of you who are looking for casing, go explore their website. Now, this video is not sponsored, and everything I had to buy myself with no discount whatsoever. How does it sound? Now, my first reaction was, wow, if you blind test me with this amp, I might not be able to tell it is Class D. Now, let me list out some of the issues with Class D amp. It can sound a bit dry. It has a slight dip in the upper mid-range. Usually, it is neutral sounding, which is a bit lean, boring for some. And finally, Class D bass tends to favor speed and nuance over meat and muscle. You see, this amp is smooth and sweet. Did I say sweet? You're probably wondering, maybe I've plugged it accidentally to my tube amps, because there is no way Class D amp can be described as sweet. Okay. Now, I don't know what sweet means to other audiophiles, but for me, sweet means the top end is not aggressive nor edgy. There is a smoothness and softness to it. Another word I can think of is like it's a bit mellow. Think of it as when someone whispers to you, that lack of aggressiveness. So when I heard those sound characteristics, I thought of sweetness. It crossed my mind. And later on, Mr. Vintage used the exact same words to describe it, so it was a shock for me. Now keep in mind, we do use Tube Preamp to deal with some of the Class D shortcomings, so you might need to pair it with a Tube Preamp to achieve what I'm talking about. Now, because of those sound characteristics, this amp is easy to listen to, good for long listening sessions. I told this story in one of my last videos when my audio buddy Mr. Quad, who hates Focal because he finds them too bright, used this amp to listen to my Focal 1008 BE speaker and found it not edgy at all. His view of Focal changed 100% with this Purifi amp. Once he switched to his Macintosh amp, he couldn't listen to those Focal 100 BE anymore because he found it too bright. So this amp has enough smoothness to tame Focal speakers. Some people will like that, while others will not. Question of taste. Next, just like most Class D amps, it has a good airy soundstage with good instrument separation, clear and neutral mid-range, fast and tight bass, and above all, the top end is refined enough, which I expect at this price. Overall, I guess that's how it sounds. Now, having said all the good things about this amp, I was not satisfied. For me, it is good, but not reference level good. If I'm going to design an amp, I want reference level performance. That one thing that bothered me is that the bass was too polite and mellow. I wanted the bass to be more aggressive and dynamic. Sure, it sounded good, as is, but when I'm building an amp, I want nothing to bother me. So here I was, stuck. Now, putting the cost problem aside, do I continue with my project or abandon it? Now, fortunately, Mr. Amplifier came to the rescue. Now, I call him Mr. Amplifier because he builds his own amplifiers. One of the amps he built and he lent me recently was a Class A amp. Maybe one day I should make a video on it. You see, originally the project required Doge to build me a tube input buffer board to elevate the performance. I was using the kit input buffer board. So Mr. Amplifier suggested that I try this input buffer board from Neurochrome to see if it at least changed the bass performance. Now, Tom from Neurochrome was very generous and he loaned me one for 2 weeks. When I got it, and within minutes of listening to it, I decided and told Tom, hey, you're not getting this back. Just send me the bill. The bass had that extra aggressiveness and dynamic I was looking for. Now, I did lose the top end smoothness a bit, but I was way more excited and happy with this input buffer board. For me, the amp went from, it's okay, to, oh yeah. So, can this upgraded amp challenge the $4,000 Class D amps I have? I would say, for many of you, it even surpasses it. For those of you who want a smoother, less aggressive, and more analog presentation, well, more analog in the sense of lack of harshness in upper mids, sure. Now, having said that, what my other high-end Class D amps can do better is it feels like there is more muscle and oomph. You might not know until you actually get a chance to A/B test it, because by itself, this Purifi amp does feel pretty dynamic and strong. Now, when Mr. Vintage A/B tested it against his ATI AT522 NC amp, now that's a Class D Hypex NC 500 amps 200 watt, he said the ATI feels like there's more power. Now, we were wondering if it had to do with the power supply. That ATI amp has a linear power supply with a toroidal transformer and weighs a lot more than this Purifi amp. This amp, I can lift it up with one hand. Now, the same can be said when Mr. Cantor compared it to his Class D 200 Class D amp. Now, this is not a deal breaker for most people because until you can A/B test it against other amps, I don't think most people will notice that. Even a difficult speaker like the Quad 2905, Mr. Quad told me, yeah, this Purifi amp is able to drive it. It's just that us audiophiles, we like to pick things apart. Now, before ending the video, if you plan to subscribe, please don't forget to hit the notification bell, else you would have just wasted your energy because you will not get notified of any new videos. Also, there's now Patreon if you would like to support the channel. So let's wrap it up at this point. Now this Purifi amp is a step forward for me because I find the top end does not sound like a typical Class D amp. In my opinion, the sound quality depends a lot on the power supply and the input buffer board. Now, if you search online, you'll find a few companies using this Purifi Class D module, but use their own custom input buffer board and sometimes even their custom power supply. For example, this company I found, VTV Amplifier, even has a tube input buffer board offering. Oh, VTV, for the odd chance you are watching this, you should send me one for review. Now, another company that uses Purifi amp is NAD. For example, you will find Purifi amps in the new NAD M33 all-in-one $5,000 amp. That one looks like it has a custom power supply and input buffer board. Now, in my audiophile circle, we use tube front end to go with this Purifi amp for the best results. For example, the Doge 7 Tube DAC and the Doge 8 Tube Preamp. The Doge 7 and 8, they're very revealing and it pairs well with this smooth sounding Purifi amp. Now, my personal recommendation is if you plan to get this kit, consider using an aftermarket input buffer board. There's not much we can do about the power supply since most of us can't design one. Do keep in mind that also means you need to find a casing to fit it. Now, overall, it was a good experience for me. Now, most of my audiophile buddies were satisfied with its performance. And once I finish my KT150 tube amp project, I will revisit this project again combining Class D amp and tube amp because I really think Class D has advanced to the point where it is a serious competitor to high-end Class AB amps. Alright, so I think that's about it for today and I'll see you guys next time.